Hello and welcome to the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast. I'm Simon Canton.
And I'm Dave Higgins.
And today we're going to be talking about style makes all the difference. But before we do that, we'll do our usual weekly roundup. And Dave, you can go first.
Okay, so it's been 2 weeks. So more drabbles written, published, and gaining a little bit of interest. Been doing more poking and prodding at the outline for the next Dragons and Magic book, and unfortunately came down with a bit of a cold, so I've lost a chunk of this week to that. I'm still possibly sounding a bit gravelly. So that's me.
And as for me, it's just been programming. And as I said, I'm not going to bore people with programming talk. So we can just go straight into the topic. So Dave, you suggested this topic. So do you want to introduce it?
But it was off the suggestions list you sent a while ago. But yes, sure.
Oh, okay.
Well, style clearly makes a difference. Imagine The Big Easy, or Big Sleep, in the style of Dr. Seuss. So Philip Marlowe walking these mean streets he does not like. He does not like these streets of me. I can't even do noir and Dr. Seuss together well enough to sound like either. So obviously, style makes a difference, but the trick for me is situations where there isn't necessarily an overt style. This you can, in sort of epic fantasy, they start off every book in the series with the same phrase. The Wind of Time, the Wheel of Time starts off with the wind was blowing across, or something like that. And there's a very stylized opening to it in very formal language. That's very true of epic fantasy. Of ordinary fantasy, there isn't an overt style to it. But I think there is a certain unconscious style that readers expect from their fantasy. Not just that it's sort of fantastical, so it's got the hero with a sword rather than a ray gun, but that it feels the way that fantasy medievalism feels. So you can have your peasants clean or grimy, but you don't have many of them with names that don't sound fantastical, or at least sort of traditional fantasy names that are also real world names. So
yeah, I mean, you couldn't really have a Bob in a fantasy book.
Yeah, you can. There's a sort of if your fantasy book is in the Highlands or somewhere that's an analogue of the Scottish Highlands, you could have someone called Robbie, but yeah, they won't be called Bob. So, and that's the style makes all the difference thing. That not because it's because readers won't necessarily know what it is that it's so important, I think. Because if it's really different, like it's a fantasy book and then one of the characters has a ray gun somehow, then it's that fantasy book with the ray gun in it. But if one of your characters is called Bob, readers will get the same kind of, that doesn't quite fit, but because they don't know what it is, they can't process it and put it into a box. So I think style is one of the ways that readers put things in boxes. They expect something that fits in a fantasy box or a noir box to feel a certain way, to have certain plot elements, certain character archetypes, but also to be expressed in a certain way. With obviously not just one rigid way, but within boundaries or sliders on things.
So you like it's I think it's down to the interpretation of the word style, because I was thinking more in terms of author voice, I guess. Like I think style as a word can encompass a lot of different things. It can be, as you say, all the different elements you put into the book, or it can be the voice of the author, the way that it's written. As you said, like epic fantasy is the wind was blowing a lot that night because it had come down the plains from the mountains of the whatever, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas an action fantasy would just be Conan shivered from the wind and wished that he'd gone to a warmer clime or something like that.
Yeah.
It tends to be more personal and less like history and that kind of thing. It's why I don't like epic fantasy, because it's a lot of blah blah and not a lot of action.
Yeah.
But I was thinking more in terms of author voice. So, like for instance, John Scalzi popped to mind. That so Old Man's War is a great book, but not because of necessarily the ideas in it, which aren't that original. It's OAP's go to Starship Troopers, essentially. Like it's nothing particularly startlingly brilliant as an idea or anything, but it's the style or the voice of Scalzi that makes it a very entertaining book. So that was kind of how I was interpreting style, as a way that you can always tell which author is who is who. Unless they're intentionally masking their style, writing under a pseudonym, or choosing to write something and trying to push a voice onto it that they don't normally use. But so that's why I was thinking style makes all the difference, is that if any two authors write the same book, like they have the same plan, same outline, that the result will be very different based on who writes it. Like as you say, Raymond Chandler and Dr. Seuss will write two very different books based on the same outline. So I guess then the question would be, how can we either match our style to what the reader's expectations are, or develop our style to the point at which it becomes effective and draws people in. What are your thoughts on that?
One of the first sensible steps in writing is to read a lot, to read in your genre, to read in other genres, to read anything you can get your hands on, to try and work out what feels good writing to you and what doesn't. And also just get an idea of what is out there and is popular. So but where things diverge, and possibly it's an indication that developing your style isn't a one-size-fits-everyone technique, is what you should do while you're writing. I know some authors who won't read anything in their genre while they're writing a novel, because they don't want to taint their work with other people's style. I know other authors, myself included, just carry on reading the same amount, whatever they feel like. Don't avoid any specific books to So it depends on how you develop your own style. Might depend on how susceptible you are to picking up the styles of others, how firm it is already. So there's a sort of pardon me.
You okay?
Yeah, as I say, sort of coming off a cold, so a bit of a my throat caught for a moment. It says if you're write and find out if the things you're writing shift back and forth depending on what you've been reading. So obviously it depends on how fast you read. But if you're reading a book a month, potentially you wouldn't notice by looking back over your writing so easily as if you're reading a book every couple of days, that changing to a different book affects your style. But possibly the first step in developing your own style is to find out if other people's styles do pull you strongly by looking at a section of work you wrote while reading several different books to see if your style changes throughout that piece of work.
I know some people, and maybe not too many, but some people will write a page of, like, just transcribe a page of a book that they enjoy in the genre first, and then start on their own writing. The theory being that you get used to writing something that's you considered very good, and then continue on creating original stuff with that same kind of thought process. The same balance, I think.
It's an interesting, I don't know, and again it depends on whether you're copying or drawing inspiration and flavor from, because your style is your style. And if you take two fantasy authors, even two fantasy authors who write comic fantasy, so you take Robert Asprin and Terry Pratchett, you could pick up a chunk of one of their books that you'd never read before, read it through and know which of them probably had written it, despite the fact that they both potentially write comic fantasy. So I think you priming yourself by writing a good piece of fantasy out and then moving on to your own is great if what you're looking for is the mindset of, okay, this is sort of the feel of fantasy, and now I'll go off and my story will be in my style, but I've got the flavor of it to start to put me in the right mindset to do it. Whereas if you start off and you're trying to stay in the same style as the piece you started off writing, it might straitjacket you in ways that weren't necessary.
I think I haven't tried it myself, but I would think it would give you a kind of a hybrid. So it would influence you, but wouldn't override your own. It depends how long you've been writing, I think. If you're a complete newbie to writing, then you may just ape the other person's style. Whereas if you've been writing for a while, it may just kind of influence you in a way. And I think it could be useful in terms of if you're writing it, maybe you get to see how that person is constructing sentences and paragraphs, and where the balance is between description and dialogue and action and things like that. And you could influence your writing in that way without drastically changing your own writing style. as I've mentioned before, for instance, the issue I always have is not getting enough down on the page to get the picture that's in my head into the reader's head. So if I wrote in the style of an author who does do that very well, then that might help.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like it might work. I haven't tried it either, but I could see how that would supposedly work. Where you'd get into the habit of writing an amount of information, and then your mind would continue to think, well, this is what we include.
At the same time, you don't want to copy people too closely. You want to be distinct and unique.
Yeah.
There was a rap producer who was saying that whenever a rapper is incredibly popular, he will then get 200 tapes or CDs or MP3s or whatever it is in the mail of people sounding exactly like that, who are just imitating whatever rapper is popular.
Yeah.
And that's kind of pointless. So that's kind of author voice. But going back to what you were saying about elements within a book,
yeah,
which also could be considered a style. So I would say that the majority of fantasy is based around someone who is out of place as a hero, an unlikely hero of some kind. Often someone who's from Earth and has gotten whisked away to a fantasy world, or a hobbit, or a pig farmer, or someone who's not necessarily a stereotypical hero. Like I don't know that I've ever read a fantasy book about someone who is a knight and has been raised from birth to be a warrior and a hero, who then goes on to save the realm. There must be some books out there that do that, but I can't think of any.
It's not. No, I was thinking that some of Raymond Feist's books, maybe.
I don't think I've read any of them.
Well, he's got characters who are princes and princes of the noble house who are the protagonists of fantasy novels. So I suppose the prince of a nation counts as someone who's been raised from birth to be a knight, and then goes on and saves the world. So that does work. But also he has gritty or traditional characters. So the young pickpocket who's got a heart of gold and makes good and saves someone meaningful, and random soldier 3 who gets a name and then does something mildly dramatic for his position in the world and works his way up, and merchants who become heroes. But he does have some people who are traditionally in the feudal role of being defender of the innocent.
Do you know, it'd be quite interesting. I'm not sure how you could turn it into a story, but some old man comes to a pig farmer and says, hey, you're the chosen one and you need to come and fight. And the pig farmer goes up against the first set of random guards who have no name and gets killed. And the random guards are just, this is our job. This is what we do all day, is fight. Yeah. Of course we beat a pig farmer.
Yeah.
We'd be terrible guards if we couldn't. Because they're always portrayed as slovenly and horrible people and whatever, and terrible at fighting because they can't, even though they have been warriors for 20 years, they can't defeat a guy who's never seen a sword before.
Yeah, so like stormtroopers in Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly.
Where they're able to effectively oppress a galaxy-spanning empire, but they can be beaten by a mud farmer.
Which it'd almost be like a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern kind of thing. You have two guards who essentially have no names, but just they're constantly having to kill random chosen ones who keep coming into the castle, trying to defeat the evil lord. Yeah, but anyway, that's kind of an aside. So to change genres, I would say crime or what would you call it? Cozy mystery crime has a very definite style.
Yes.
To it, the Miss Marples and the that kind of thing.
Yes.
So the elements of that tend to be that it tends to be upper class, I would say. Like you don't really see a working class murder. I don't know. Maybe you've read more than me, Dave.
Miss Marple, a lot of them take place in charming bits of England. So there are rural murders, but I can't think of any. I can't really think of any cozy mysteries that happened in the back streets of Leeds or anything.
Which, that's a very strange stylistic choice, that it's always rich people killing each other. Is it that poor people, it's considered, oh well, of course they're murderers? or what is it that, like, it's middle class, tends to be middle class or upper middle class or upper class. It's never like the coal miner's son or something like that has been killed. You do get more kind of police oriented, police procedural kind of books that deal with working class people, but the cozy mysteries, it's never just normal people. So that's a strange, like, there's those kind of things which maybe you don't think about when you're reading, but then when you're writing you have to actually consider. And even consider whether it's something that will break a story. Like if you came up with a new Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple or whatever, and you had them investigating working class mysteries, like say they're working class themselves, and they are just good at solving crimes, they're intelligent, and they are brought in to solve who killed the butcher's boy or something, that would actually be quite interesting. I think it would stand out because of that choice. I don't think that would put off people who like cozy mysteries. I could be completely wrong, though. I'm not the target audience.
Yeah. Right. I think you'd have to ease the boundaries. And you could change a certain amount before. I mean, if you change, there's always going to be someone who has a very specific thing that they like to see, and so they like cozy mysteries with a female detective who bakes, and so a cozy mystery without a female detective who bakes, they don't really like it. So you're always going to lose some people when you make a change to the form. But I think there's going to be a certain feel that you could maintain with stretching it in one direction or another. So possibly you could stretch. You could take the things that are the same, sort of certain periods, the back street, the sort of suburbs of certain towns would be like a little community. So you could potentially cite the community has something happen to them and a member of the community solves it while the police bumble around in one of those. So it will be like a little cozy village mystery, except it's set in a suburb of Manchester.
Yeah.
But because everyone still knows each other, you could do that. And so you could have your working class detective, the working class victim, and so on. But you'd be keeping the small community where everyone knows each other and police bumble around and are generally ineffectual. So yeah, I
mean, you've got the extra advantage that you could say the police don't care. Like when you're dealing with the upper class, you can't say the police don't care because they know which side their bread's buttered.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're dealing with the working class, you can say, oh, the police don't care about it. They're just going to call him a gin-soaked, coal miner or something and say he probably killed himself or something.
Yeah.
And that way it's up to the working class community to solve it themselves, and they know exactly who to call, and that's whatever. George the coal miner. So yeah, so I think we've said this before on podcasts before, but there's certainly that's a way to take the style of a genre and then just tweak one thing, but don't tweak it all. So as you say, you need to have a close-knit community. Like you have to have 8 characters who potentially could have done the murder or something, and all of them with a distinct personality.
Yeah.
And then there would have to be I've gathered you all here today because one of you is the killer.
Yeah.
Scene. And discovering of clues and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you just tweak the class of the people. So yeah, so I think that's kind of. I'm trying to think whether it may be easier to analyze a genre you don't write in.
Possibly.
Because I'm not interested in writing cozy mysteries, although I do like the idea that we just came up with. But whether fantasy, there's a tendency when you have read a ton of fantasy to think of some stylistic choices as almost being rules.
Yeah.
Like the famous one is the whole hero's journey, where some people tend to follow it slavishly. Whereas I would think of it more as a useful tool to come up with ideas for scenes, but not necessarily something.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go through a book and then say, okay, well, we have to take out that scene because it doesn't match the hero's journey, and we have to put in this scene because otherwise it won't match the hero's journey. So
yeah,
I think maybe there's conventions like that in fantasy and in science fiction and things like that we're following that are not necessarily things that will they may be hindering us, making us very samey along with the rest of modern fantasy, where we could be stretching one of those rules a bit and making it a bit different. So what would you say if we took fantasy, since we're writing Dragons and Magic?
Yeah.
So what would you say are the stylistic rules of action fantasy like we're writing?
I think for action fantasy, it has to be a proper threat. But none of this. I like a good psychological drama, where someone has an internal issue that they have to work through, maybe the remnants of a failed relationship with their uncle, who is now dead because he drowned, and they are guilt-stricken and they need to work it through. But for it to be action fantasy, you need an antagonist, something that is actually posing a real threat, either to you or to other people, to strive against. An enemy army, a dragon, an influx of barbarians, whatever. It can't be that you're trying to get over your incipient alcoholism.
So is that something that could not possibly be changed in fantasy, or could there? So there's environment stories in many genres.
Yeah.
Could there be a fantasy environment story where it's not? So say, for instance, so George R. R. Martin's planet, where it's got a oval orbit, so it's got very long winters.
Yeah.
If it was more extreme, where there was only, a short amount of time, and then you were blazing hot because you were near to the sun, and then a long time where you were a long way from the sun and nothing would grow and it's very cold. Could you have a fantasy community striving to survive in that environment, where they've only got 3 months to grow all the crops that's going to last them until they get through the hot season, and then they have to grow crops to last through the year of cold season? Or is that like my feeling? And again, this is down to whether, because I've read so much fantasy, my feeling would be, oh, that doesn't really work. But is that just my prejudices about reading fantasy causing that, or is it something that fantasy readers just wouldn't put up with?
I don't know. It immediately feels to me like science fiction,
even though it's a bunch of medieval-esque.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that I think it's that the plot driver there is orbital mechanics.
But it is in Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones no one would say isn't fantasy.
Well, the plot driver in Game of Thrones isn't. It's like there's a lot of people being utter bastards and struggling for the throne of Westeros from the bit I got through.
But the point is that they always say winter is coming, and the reason the ice zombie guys can come in is because they're going further. Their planet is going out in its oval orbit further from the sun, so everything's going to freeze. So, but then again, you do have a baddie who is linked to that part of the orbital mechanics, and no one is ever saying, you know what, I think we're going around the sun in a in a long oval.
Yeah, I don't know. It's if you wrote a world where it happened, you didn't tell me why. I don't know if it's because we started off with the discussion of why, so it's a scientific explanation of why it happened, so that immediately makes me think science. So I think of Game of Thrones, I don't think of anything about like it goes in a wonky orbit.
No, that was just something someone mentioned, but it's not a core part of the story in any way. And I wouldn't think so. In the story we're describing, I wouldn't be thinking that the medieval peasants or whatever who are trying to survive are saying, "Oh, blast this orbital mechanics stuff." More that they're thinking in terms of how can we make these crops last longer. The wolves are coming and they're starving, they're going to attack us, but not necessarily the wolves are plotting to attack us.
Yeah, so you could I don't know. interesting word. It needs something more than agriculture to be the issue, I think. But it's gathering crops to put in barns doesn't feel something that's immediately viscerally worrying to the average reader, because the average reader isn't a farmer. There'd be farmers who look at that situation and be horrified, and they'd immediately get the terror and the desperate rushing around. But 3 months to grow your food doesn't sound threatening. Like 3 months until it happens. If you put that in terms of something else, it's like in 3 months' time, the enemy army are going to arrive. In a fantasy book, most people would think 3 months until the army arrives. There's plenty of time for like putting up the defenses and getting everything ready, and this is going to be a clear win. So 3 months to grow the crops doesn't feel like enough pressure, despite the fact that objectively it's a huge problem.
I mean, you could take them out of agriculture and make them hunter-gatherers. So then the problem is that the buffalo are disappearing, or whatever it happens to be. And they're essentially, you end up with the plot of Ice Age, the kids movie, where the ice is coming, it's going to freeze everything, and no one's going to be able to survive. So they have to, like, potentially you could say that they have to migrate south when it's going into the icy period in order to survive, and then north when it goes into the hot period in order to survive, because it's too hot in the hot period to be on the equator, and it's too cold in the cold period to be too far north. So then you've got people constantly having to go back and forth through whatever dangers you put in. There you've got an environment story without, like, I think there's a timer element to it, essentially. We need to get out of here. If we're still here in a week's time or a month's time, or whatever it happens to be, and then you can have them fall behind because someone's injured, and do they leave the injured person behind? And
but that feels better than farming, because it's more small, immediate daily threats. And someone trips and sprains an ankle, that's an immediate threat. It's like, well, we've got to move today. We've got to move every day. Whereas, oh no, the crops haven't grown as much as we'd hoped today. Do we sacrifice more water? Doesn't have that same feeling of urgency to the ordinary person, I think.
Yeah. But then if you took that hunter-gatherer, always on the move thing, would that feel like a fantasy story? If you read that and it said this is action fantasy, and they're fantasy people in that they're kind of medieval peasant type of people or whatever. And they're fighting wolves, so there is action, or they're fighting whatever the thing is. My feeling would be that I would read that and go, well, that's maybe, even if it's a good book, I'd go, well, that's not really a fantasy book. Even if, say, they're fighting sun dragons who can survive in the heat because of their reflective scales or something. I think saying that, if you loaded enough fantasy cliche animals and races and things into it, then you could get over the fact. So if you have the elves, the dwarves, for instance, stay underground because there they can regulate the temperature. Like it's not the surface. They're not burning or freezing all the time. The elves have some kind of maybe a way of surviving in the forest or something, and it's only the humans that are so stupid that they have to go back and forth all the time. then I think you'd start to push it into the realm of fantasy where people would go, oh yeah, that's a good fantasy book.
Yeah.
As an original idea. Maybe. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of, in terms of elements, I think you could dissect, like that's just an example, obviously, but you could dissect your genre that you're writing in and switch up one element of the style of that genre without pushing it so far. Like, as I say, like if you start putting in elves and dwarves and dragons and things like that, then people will go, yes, it's a fantasy book, but it's a very strange one, and you should definitely give it a read.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're kind of coming up on our normal time.
Yeah.
And your voice is...
My voice is starting to go.
Yeah, so we might stop there. Was there anything you wanted to add at the end, Dave?
Don't think so, no.
Everyone go and read Dave's Drabbles. Dave J. Higgins .wordpress.com.
Yep.
Right? Yep.
jhiggins.wordpress.com, yes.
Cool. Go and read those. And thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Bye for now.